A Cold Love Story was one of Liam Vicker's original creepypastas from back in the day. If I recall, the original came out around 2013, close to when I graduated high school, and the fan wiki states that it was specifically August 26, 2013. From memory alone, I can say that there are at least 4 different versions of the story. The original, the remake, the retold story from Sarah's perspective, and lastly the game. There was also another story called Puppet Game where Sarah comes back and can be considered a sequel if you consider the story canon. More on that later. It's not the best story ever told, but it's definitely in the top 3 favorites of mine, and has a special place in my heart. A quick rundown for those of you who have decided not to listen to the story is a high schooler named John befriends a mysterious lonely girl. People around him start to go missing, and it turns out that the new girl, Sarah Duffy, has been killing them all because she's crazy and loves him, kind of. In most of the stories, the fate of John is left to our own speculations, but it's heavily implied that he dies either way, likely after rejecting Sarah's affection, and in Puppet Game, Sarah admits to killing him. Liam Vickers has stated that he made the story after being slightly inspired from a friend he rode the bus with. He was impressed by how many people loved his original character, and so he has kept Sarah by his side a decade later. He uses John and Sarah as stapled characters for his stories, where they can be made victims, background characters, and even villains. Even when the female lead character isn't named Sarah, you can still find little details that are of reference to her or inspired by her. You could say she's the mother of all monster girls in the Liam Vickerverse. The original story is currently considered lost media. No one seems to have a copy of it, and trust me, I have looked around. I barely remember listening to the original, and if it makes you feel any better, you're not really missing out on much. After this, he released the retold version of the story from Sarah's perspective, which works as a prequel. This version is my personal favorite, but I'll explain why in a minute. Then he uploaded the remastered version, which brings us back to the original story with John, but with added changes and improvements on the original. And eventually, he made an interactive novel that you can still play today in the fan wiki. Links in the description below. All of these stories have retcons and inconsistencies with one another, so the canon version is really up to you. But personally, I like to combine all of them by ignoring specific details or giving myself logical explanations, which I will go over now. Canonically, Sarah first ends the life of her own parents by poisoning them. She ends their life because of their constant abuse of her, and because her father accidentally hits a student with his car and blames it on Sarah. He forces her to bury the body and tries to gaslight Sarah into thinking that she's responsible for this. This causes her to eventually snap. However, in the video game novel, Liam tries to retcon that Sarah's dad wasn't really her biological father, and instead, she was the result of a 1-year kidnapping where her mom was taken by the father's best friend and then taken advantage of, which conceived Sarah. Then, apparently and conveniently, the kidnapper escapes. Years go by and Sarah gets older. Old enough to get traumatized, that is, because one day Sarah's dad finds the location of the kidnapper because reasons, and takes Sarah with him to witness him shoot down her biological father. This apparently makes the family more miserable, and then we loop back to the part where he hits the kid with the car, which causes her parents to lock Sarah away in fear that she would turn them into the cops. Hence, why she poisoned them. At least in this version. This retcon from the animated novel is such garbage and cringy. A Cold Love Story retold has the perfect origins for Sarah. The animated novel version is frankly too ridiculous, and normally I would ignore it and not consider it canon, but then I had an interesting thought. What if both events are canon? but one is a lie. Hear me out. In the animated novel, if you make the right decisions, Sarah tells John more about her story by using poorly drawn pictures. But what if these pictures and origins are just a lie from Sarah? Throughout the entire story, from beginning to end, Sarah has been ruthless, manipulative, delusional, and a liar. Why should we believe her drawings? In the retold version, it's made quite clear that Sarah is extremely scared that John will think less of her for all the killing she's done. What if this is just a desperate attempt at pity from her? Another thing that I think should be retconned is the killing of John's parents and Sarah somehow tricking John into thinking they were going on vacation for a week without him. It's not quite clear if she's been hiding their bodies in John's house or if she moved them to his room by the end of the story. But either way, all options are extremely outlandish. A cold love story never states that Sarah is supernatural, so she really shouldn't be able to move all those bodies in such a short amount of time without anybody noticing. Even more outlandish to think that John wouldn't notice corpses in his own room or a hole in his room inside of his closet for a whole week. Then there's the fact that Sarah apparently guns down an entire school bus using her father's gun. This girl has never handled a firearm before, and she goes John Wick on everybody and wins. And for some reason, it takes all day for the police to find the bus. You would think that they would walk to the nearby houses to ask questions, or to look for the two students that were missing from the carnage that also happened to live nearby. I feel like Liam tried to overcomplicate this when it could have been really simple. Have John's parents actually go on vacation without him. It would have been a nice parallel to Sarah's neglectful parents. Then have Sarah attempt to have her snow day with John during a weekend so that she doesn't have to worry about the bus. And then you can still add tension by having her plan to end John's life at the end of their date, so she can keep him forever. Oh, but still have her behead Max. That still works in between. Next on the list is John's friend Jenna. She's Sarah's first real victim after her parents. In the retold version, Jenna seems to be wearing a bow. As far as I know, the bow never gets mentioned or shown in the other versions of the story, so maybe it's something from the original version that I simply forgot about. Sarah takes her bow and puts it on herself to look more like Jenna, hoping that John will like it. I really like that little detail because we would later see it again in Murder Drones, with Tessa's bow being passed around every time the owner gets deleted, and the new owner trying to look like the last. I really hope we keep seeing the murder bow being passed around in later stories. Now let's talk about some fun Easter eggs. In the story, Sarah has her dead parents hanging around the dining room. She plays pretend with their bodies and keeps trying to feed them. So her dining room is very dirty with dishes while the bodies sit at the table. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because that's exactly what happened in Murder Drones when the gang discovers Doll's room. Both Murder Drones and A Cold Love Story take place in snowy pine wood-like environments, but that's likely because Liam really likes that type of setting because he comes from Colorado. Uzi and Sarah are both portrayed as being shorter than the rest of their classmates. They both have an eternal purple beanie in their heads, both are super bipolar and lonely girls, and both have terrible parents. Something interesting in the show that stood out to me was the Cabin Fever episode where Uzi becomes jealous of her classmates because they start befriending Ed. Then she just so happens to eat her classmates right after. But hey, that was just Sin's doing, right? In A Cold Love Story, Sarah decides to take out everybody in the bus because she realizes that John was very popular with the ladies, and eventually one of them would ask him out. It's also really funny that we see the school bus for the first time in that episode. So it's either an Easter egg or heavily implied, or heavily inspired. Anyways, let me talk about some fan canon of mine. As I stated before, the story usually ends with Sarah giving John a kiss and leaving the ending ambiguous for the audience. But if you paid attention, then you would understand that there's like an almost 100% chance that Sarah ended his life. If not there, then eventually. Sarah suffers from some kind of bipolar disorder, along with sociopathic tendencies, paranoia, and strong delusions that might be early symptoms of schizophrenia. And anyone who played the game will understand that any little thing could set her off. And speaking of endings, I also think it's likely that she was going to end her own life as well. Sarah was acting quick and rash because she thought that the world was going to take away her only shot at happiness. She wanted that snow day to be perfect, and by that point, death was her ultimate perfection. The cops would eventually find her and separate her from her perfect corpse family, so I can definitely see herself taking herself out to complete the perfect snow day. I also think it's interesting that the ending credit song is called Eternity by Kate Mitz. Though you could say it's a song about John and not Sarah, because in the lyrics themselves has the phrase, "Will she let me live?" Another fun theory of mine is the possibility that Sarah was actually turning into an actual supernatural monster, like some kind of ghoul or wendigo. By the end of the story, she is described as being extremely pale, malnourished, and borderline look like a corpse. Have you ever noticed that weird corpse pose Liam likes to draw? Because that's exactly how Sarah was being described as. If something supernatural was happening, then that would explain her killing abilities and strength. She is also portrayed as being immune to the cold, so much so that she completely forgets to wear a jacket in freezing weather. Even in Puppet Game, they nickname her Cold because of this. The story implies that she's used to the cold because she needs it to preserve the corpses in her house. So if it's not supernatural, then I wonder if maybe Sarah was suffering from early stages of hypothermia, which would add more credence to the theory that she dies at the end of the story. And to add one final kernel of mystery, at the end of Puppet Game, she does become a ghoulish monster because of a vampire virus. She becomes extremely resilient and strong, so much so that she literally 1v1s a flipping left hand and wins. That was technically the last we ever saw of that Sarah. But I like to think that she won the Puppet Game and wished to be reincarnated in another world. To get it right this time! I'll talk more about Puppet Game in a later episode. In the meantime, let's keep going. I really enjoyed A Cold Love Story. It's truly lightning in a bottle, but it's a shame that Liam tries to hide it. From what I understand, the official story has been unlisted from his channel, and most people can only listen to it using archives. My personal favorite version is the retold version, because it has a really clever origin stories. Perhaps Liam didn't intend it to be that clever, but I thought it was really well written. It's not too outlandish, and it has the right type of events that would set our character on her dark path. At the start of Sarah's saga, we immediately get hit with her angry, abusive parents. It's not too much to handle, but things take a turn for the worse when her dad hits a school student because he was drinking while driving. In a desperate and selfish attempt at getting away with it, the father blames and gaslights Sarah into taking responsibility for the accident. Sarah is then forced into hiding the body in the snow, and this alone is a great way for our character to build up trauma and resentment while still keeping things in a realistic setting. But this alone is still not enough to break Sarah into the monster that she would become. As time goes by, the accident only adds more tension to our dysfunctional family, and it ramps up the parents' abuse. Eventually, Sarah's guilt and depression begins to boil up into anger, and she puts rat poison in their food to punish them. This is the first time we see Sarah act out her rage, and that blind anger will lead her throughout the rest of the story. See, a common theme seems to be that she lets her anger take over without thinking ahead. She has no idea what to do afterwards, and she realizes that her parents might only be passed out and could wake back up. In fear of retaliation, she bashes their heads with a hammer to make sure that they stay dead. But this action wasn't about anger or revenge, but simple fear and desperation. As a result, Sarah's sanity dwindles quickly. Even more so when she finally stops to think and realizes that she could have just gone to the cops and told on her parents. Sarah then decides to play it cool and begins to attend school as the new year begins. In the bus stop, she meets John, and Sarah becomes obsessed with him due to being the first happy thing to happen to her in a very long and dark time. Meanwhile, back at home, Sarah is becoming more delusional. She's been talking to her dead parents and pretending like they are alive. But she doesn't portray them as the abusive parents they were. Instead, Sarah pretends to have the perfect family. And these delusions would become everyone's downfall, because Sarah would begin to associate happiness and relationships with death. Eventually, John's female friend Jenna would show up, and this would cause Sarah to panic. In a desperate attempt to keep John to herself, she tricks Jenna and ends her life. This would mark the first innocent victim, and in typical Sarah fashion, she pretends Jenna and her are now best friends. This is what I would consider the point of no return. Part of the tragedy of A Cold Love Story is how Sarah had multiple chances to turn her life around, but simply kept doubling down on her actions. Before Jenna, Sarah could have easily gone to the police and turned herself in. She could have proven that her parents ran over a student by showing them the location of the body, and used that as a defense for why she did what she did. The court would have likely gone easy on her, and based on what we know about John, he would have likely still given Sarah a chance to be friends, and maybe even more. But now Sarah has taken one of his best friends. There is no turning back. Soon after, a girl starts talking to Sarah about John. She realizes that John is a pretty popular guy, and it would only be a matter of time before someone else took him from her. And once again, Sarah doubles down, and the rest is history. One of the biggest tragedies in the story is that you kind of realize that Sarah could easily be well loved by most, if not all, of her classmates. Even John points out how popular with the boys she could be if she only opened up more. A Cold Love Story only takes place in the first few weeks of the school year, so given enough time, other boys would have eventually approached Sarah, and maybe that would have been enough to improve her mental state. But Sarah's anger is like a demon, possessing her at the worst times, keeping her from slowing down and thinking. In the end, I don't think she really loved John either. Everything that she did only made his life worse. I think she was desperately trying to keep control of her life because of how much abuse she had experienced, which is poetic, as it reflects her parents, who were also losing themselves to their inner demons, hiding secrets, and hurting the people they were supposed to love and take care of. A love story without the love. A cold love story.